The world as they knew it was gone. In the small town of Crestwood, the quiet hum of everyday life was suddenly shattered by the roar of chaos that spread across the globe. Life had always been predictable, people worked, families gathered, and cities bustled with the usual noise. But that was before the outbreak. Before the zombie uprising. Before humanity's last hope crumbled into dust. It began slowly. Whispers about a strange disease in the news. People on the streets coughing, fainting, and sometimes even collapsing. The government said it was nothing to worry about, but those in the know, those who had seen the early warning signs, knew better. The first reports were coming from overseas, cases of people attacking others, acting erratically, as if they were rabid. The disease was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted, and soon it wasn't just in the faraway cities. It was on the streets. It was at their doorstep. The survivors in Crestwood were the lucky ones, at least for the first few days. Sheltered in their homes, they watched in horror as the world descended into madness. Social media went dark. Phones stopped working. The news channels, once a lifeline, only showed images of destruction, burning buildings, panicked crowds, and the dead rising again. No one knew what to do. The government issued a nationwide quarantine, but it was too late. The infected were already everywhere. No safe place was safe anymore. For Sarah, a young woman who had once been an aspiring journalist, the apocalypse came like a nightmare she could never wake up from. She had seen so much of the world through the lens of her camera, capturing stories of war and injustice. But none of that prepared her for what came next. The zombies were not just mindless killers, they were the dead walking. Hungry, relentless, and terrifying. Sarah's instinct was to run, to escape the chaos that was consuming her town, but she couldn't abandon her family. Her father, once a strong and confident man, was now terrified and frail. Her younger brother, Ben, was scared too, though he tried to be brave for their sake. The family was holed up in their house, armed with whatever they could find, barricading the windows and doors. Sarah kept a lookout, scanning the streets for any signs of movement, any survivors who might need help. But the world outside was unrecognizable. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the occasional moan or the sound of heavy footsteps. It wasn't long before Sarah realized they were not alone. The zombies had come. And they were hunting. Across town, another group of survivors had banded together in the local high school. Among them was Marcus, a former military man who had been stationed at a nearby base before the outbreak. His experience in combat had given him a sense of leadership, a sense of purpose that the others lacked. They were a diverse group, people from all walks of life who had found each other in the chaos. Some had lost family members. Others had barely escaped death. They all shared one common bond: survival. Marcus quickly became the de facto leader of the group. With his military training and strategic mind, he was able to guide them through the initial days of the outbreak. They fortified the school, setting up barricades, and scavenged supplies from nearby stores. But even Marcus knew that this wouldn't last. The zombies were getting closer. They were relentless. And sooner or later, the survivors would have to make a choice: stay and fight or risk being overrun by the undead. In the meantime, Sarah's family remained trapped in their home, unsure of what the future would hold. Sarah had heard rumors of other survivors, but the roads were too dangerous to travel. The undead lurked around every corner, waiting for their next meal. But Sarah couldn't just wait. She needed to know what had happened to the world, and if there were any other survivors out there. It wasn't long before she made a decision: she would venture out. She couldn't do it alone, though. She needed help. Her brother, Ben, insisted on coming along, despite her protests. And, despite the fear that gripped them, her father refused to stay behind either. They would face the nightmare together, even if it meant they were walking into the jaws of death. The journey outside their home was a gamble, but Sarah was determined. The world was falling apart, but there was still a flicker of hope deep within her, a belief that there could still be a way to fight back. As they made their way through the deserted streets, she saw the destruction firsthand. Buildings that once stood tall were now reduced to rubble. Cars lay abandoned, some overturned, others with their doors wide open, as if their owners had been snatched away in the blink of an eye. And then, in the distance, they saw it, a group of survivors, armed and fighting back. It was the first sign of life outside their home in days. But what would Sarah find when she joined them? Would they be friendly? Or would they be just another danger in a world where trust had become a rare commodity? The stakes had never been higher. And the story of their fight against the apocalypse was just beginning. As Sarah, her father, and Ben approached the group of survivors in the distance, they moved with a mixture of caution and urgency. The atmosphere was heavy, each step fraught with the possibility of danger. They had heard stories of groups that didn't welcome strangers, of people who would do anything to protect what little they had left, even if it meant turning on others. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and the need for safety outweighed the fear of the unknown. The group, holed up in an old gas station, seemed well organized. Sarah couldn't help but notice the way they moved, the way they communicated with each other without words, gestures, nods, silent warnings. It was clear they had survived together for some time. The moment they noticed Sarah and her family, a tense silence fell over the group. A man stepped forward, his hand on the handle of a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice gruff, his eyes scanning them carefully. He was tall, with short cropped hair, a beard, and a hardened expression. There was no kindness in his gaze, only suspicion. Sarah held her breath, stepping forward with her hands raised slightly, trying to show she meant no harm. "We're just looking for shelter," she explained. "We've been on our own for days. We have supplies. We just need a safe place." The man studied them for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. Ben tugged at Sarah's sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think they'll let us stay?" Before Sarah could answer, the man spoke again, this time with a touch of hesitation. "You're lucky we're not picking off strays today. We've got enough to worry about as it is." He paused, giving them one last scrutinizing look. "You can stay for now. But any funny business, and you're out." Relieved but wary, Sarah nodded quickly. "Thank you. We'll be on our best behavior." The man grunted, stepping aside to let them pass. As they entered the gas station, Sarah's eyes immediately adjusted to the dim light inside. The place wasn't much, a cracked counter, dusty shelves, and an old fridge with just a few cans of food left. But the survivors had made do. A fire crackled in the corner, a makeshift barricade covered the windows, and a handful of people moved about, going through supplies and keeping watch. Marcus, the leader of the group, stood in the back, his posture rigid, arms crossed. He was a tall, imposing figure, his military background evident in the way he carried himself. As Sarah and her family settled in, Marcus approached them with a sharp look in his eyes. "I'm Marcus," he said, his tone authoritative but not unfriendly. "This is our home now. If you want to stay, you follow the rules. We keep a strict watch, no wandering off alone, and we work together. Understood?" Sarah nodded, grateful for his clear leadership. "Understood." Ben, ever the curious one, looked around the room. "How long have you all been here?" "About a week now," Marcus answered, his voice steady but hinting at the strain of prolonged survival. "Before that, we were holed up in a shelter downtown, but it got overrun. We barely made it out." Sarah's stomach churned at the thought. The world had become a battleground. People fighting for their lives, not just against the undead, but against each other. Trust was a luxury, and it was clear that even the survivors here had seen their fair share of violence. "Is it always this quiet?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the gas station, noting the tense faces around her. Marcus gave a short laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Quiet before the storm," he muttered. "We've got food for a few days, but we can't afford to sit still for too long. Supplies are running low, and the horde is moving in on us. We need to make a plan for what comes next." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. They couldn't afford to wait. She didn't know how much longer they could all survive here before the situation became dire. Before she could speak, a young woman approached them, her face pale but determined. "Sarah, right?" she asked, her voice soft yet firm. "Yeah," Sarah replied, surprised that anyone knew her name. "How did you?" "I've been keeping an eye on you." "We have to talk," the woman said urgently, pulling Sarah aside. "We can't stay here much longer. Marcus is planning a raid. He wants to hit the local store for more supplies. But it's too dangerous. I think he's making a mistake." Sarah's eyes widened. A raid? They had no idea what they were up against. Going out there, into the heart of a town swarming with zombies, was risky at best. But they needed supplies if they were going to survive. "I don't know if we have a choice," Sarah replied quietly. "We can't stay here forever." The woman nodded grimly. "But we don't have to do it Marcus's way. We can find another way, a safer one." Sarah thought for a moment, weighing her options. The clock was ticking. They couldn't afford to wait much longer. And she had to make a decision: follow Marcus in his dangerous plan, or listen to the woman's suggestion for an alternative strategy. She didn't know what would be worse, staying behind and risking the unknown dangers of a zombie-filled world, or facing off against the undead in a desperate fight for survival. The decision weighed heavily on Sarah's shoulders as she stood in the corner of the gas station, listening intently to the young woman's warnings. She felt torn between two very different paths, one filled with the brutal practicality of Marcus's plan and the other, more uncertain, yet potentially safer. She turned over the possibilities in her mind, but there was one undeniable truth: they couldn't stay in the gas station forever. "I'm telling you, Marcus's plan is too risky," the woman, whose name was Ellie, insisted, her voice filled with urgency. "We don't know what we're walking into. He thinks he can just stroll into that store and come back with everything we need. But if we get caught out there, we won't make it back." Sarah's mind raced. It was tempting to trust Marcus. He had led his group this far, and his military experience had kept them alive. But Ellie's warnings made sense. The area was already swarming with zombies, and there was no telling how many more were moving through the town. If they ventured into the heart of the apocalypse without proper planning, they could be walking straight into a death trap. "We need to gather more information," Sarah said finally, her voice firm. "I'm going with him. But I'll keep my eyes open for another way. I'll figure something out." Ellie nodded, her expression still one of concern. "Just be careful. I'll back you up if you need help, but I can't go out there. It's too dangerous for me." She glanced around the gas station, where the others were preparing for the raid, packing up supplies and double-checking weapons. "The others won't listen to me, but they might listen to you." Sarah glanced at the group, taking note of Marcus's focused demeanor. He wasn't giving any indication of doubt, and he seemed eager to get going. He was already giving orders, checking maps, and laying out their route. As much as she wanted to avoid the raid, she knew that if she wanted to protect her family and the rest of the survivors, she had to go along with Marcus's plan, for now. With a final nod to Ellie, Sarah made her way toward the others. She found her father and Ben huddled near the makeshift barricades, their faces etched with fear but also a glimmer of hope. "We're going with them," Sarah announced, her tone resolute. "We don't have any other choice." Ben's eyes widened with concern. "You mean, a raid? Are you sure that's a good idea?" Sarah nodded, forcing a smile despite the dread creeping up her spine. "We have to take risks, Ben. If we don't get more supplies, we'll starve. Or worse." Her father, who had been silent for most of the morning, looked up at her with a mixture of pride and fear. "I trust you, Sarah. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Sarah said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder for reassurance. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him now, not after everything they had been through. "We'll be fine." With the group gathered and their plan set, Marcus called everyone to attention. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying authority as he surveyed the survivors. "This is a supply run. We'll hit the store on Elm Street. It's close enough that we can make it there and back before the zombies notice. But you all need to stay alert, and don't wander off. We've got one shot at this." The group nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They gathered their weapons, checked their ammo, and began moving out in small groups. Sarah and her family followed Marcus's lead, taking a position near the rear. Her heart pounded in her chest as they stepped into the streets of Crestwood, the town they had once called home. Now, it was unrecognizable, streets littered with abandoned cars, broken windows, and the distant sound of moaning. The air was thick with tension. Every corner they turned, every shadow that stretched across the road, seemed like a potential threat. Sarah kept her eyes darting around, ever watchful for any sign of movement. The world was a maze of danger, and every turn could lead them into the jaws of death. As they approached the store, Sarah's pulse quickened. She could see the building in the distance, its faded sign barely visible through the haze of smoke and dust that had begun to settle over the town. The windows were shattered, and the door hung open, an invitation to disaster. But Marcus was determined. He raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. "Stay here," he ordered. "I'll go in first. Everyone else, wait for my signal." The survivors spread out, taking cover behind nearby vehicles and debris, ready to spring into action. Sarah's heart raced as she watched Marcus move toward the store, his every step calculated, his gun held tightly in his hands. She knew he wasn't just leading them into danger, he was leading them into the unknown. As the minutes dragged on, the silence was deafening. Sarah's nerves were stretched thin. Every breath she took felt like it could be her last. And then, without warning, a shot rang out. "Move in!" Marcus shouted. The group surged forward, guns raised, ready for anything. Sarah felt her adrenaline kick in as they entered the store, her eyes scanning every aisle, every corner for any sign of movement. The place was eerily quiet, no zombies in sight. But that didn't mean it was safe. They began gathering supplies, canned food, water, medical kits, anything they could carry. It wasn't much, but it was something. As Sarah picked up a box of first aid supplies, she heard a faint noise from the back of the store. A scraping sound, like nails on metal. Her heart froze. The zombies weren't far. The scraping sound echoed through the aisles, sending a chill down Sarah's spine. It was unmistakable, the unmistakable noise of the undead. Her hand instinctively tightened around the handle of the crowbar she had been carrying, and she shot a quick glance at Marcus, who was already moving toward the back of the store. The survivors froze, their eyes widening with realization. They were not alone. The undead had already infiltrated the place. "Quiet!" Marcus hissed, signaling for the group to remain still. His voice was low but firm, a command that carried weight. He motioned for two of the others, a tall man named Ethan and a woman named Leah, to follow him as he crept toward the source of the noise. Sarah's heart pounded as she tried to remain as silent as possible. Every breath seemed too loud in the thick, oppressive silence. Ben, who had been nervously clutching a metal pipe, leaned in close to Sarah. "What should we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Fear was evident in his eyes. This was the first time they had encountered the undead face to face, and it was clear he wasn't prepared for what came next. "Stay close to me," Sarah whispered back, her tone more reassuring than she felt. She glanced over at her father, who had moved to a nearby shelf to hide, his face pale and tense. There was nothing more she could say to comfort him. They were all in this together, and all they could do was survive. The group continued to move in total silence, each survivor taking careful, measured steps. The tension in the air was palpable, the slightest noise threatening to betray them. Marcus, Ethan, and Leah reached the back of the store, their weapons ready, eyes darting between the shelves and the shadows. There, at the far end, Sarah saw the first of them, one of the undead. It was hunched over, its pale, rotting skin a grotesque sight as it scraped its claws across the metal shelves in search of food, or anything to devour. It didn't seem to notice the survivors yet. Its head turned, almost as if sensing something, and then it resumed its mindless search. Sarah's stomach churned as she watched it move, slow, deliberate, but horrifyingly relentless. "Stay down," Marcus whispered to Ethan and Leah, signaling them to take their positions. He was preparing for the strike. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the others took their marks, their weapons raised. The tension in the store was unbearable, the waiting almost worse than facing the creatures. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, fast and decisive, striking the zombie in the back of the head with a swift blow from his rifle's butt. The undead creature collapsed, its body hitting the floor with a sickening thud. It twitched once, twice, and then lay still. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet again. Then, another scraping sound echoed from deeper within the store. "They're coming," Leah muttered, her voice low but full of urgency. "We need to move, now." Marcus didn't need any further prompting. "Everyone, grab what you can and head for the exit. We're not staying here a moment longer." The survivors scrambled, their adrenaline coursing through their veins as they rushed to collect the last of the supplies. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears, every movement frantic, every sound amplified. Her hands were shaking as she stuffed cans and water bottles into her pack. She had to keep her focus, keep her mind on the task at hand. But the fear was creeping in, threatening to overwhelm her. Ben was by her side, his eyes wide with panic. "Are we going to make it out?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We will," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. They had to make it out. There was no other option. The noise from the back of the store grew louder as more zombies shuffled into view. The survivors hurried to the front, the last of the supplies clutched tightly in their hands. Marcus was the first to reach the exit, his gun raised, scanning the area outside. When he saw that it was clear, he waved the group forward. "Move! Move now," he shouted. The survivors bolted for the door, a frantic sprint toward freedom. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as they burst out into the street, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet town. They made it to the cover of a nearby car, where Marcus paused, signaling for everyone to stop. "Get in position," he ordered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We're not out of the woods yet." Sarah crouched low, trying to catch her breath, her heart racing. She glanced at her father and Ben, who were both breathing heavily, but at least they were safe, for now. But the danger wasn't over. The sound of the zombies could still be heard in the distance, and they needed to keep moving. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We get out of here," Marcus replied, his voice grim. "The raid was successful, but it's only a matter of time before more of them show up. We need to get back to the gas station and fortify our position." "Agreed," Sarah said, glancing around. The streets were still eerily silent, but she knew that wouldn't last long. The undead were drawn to noise, and it wouldn't be long before they realized the survivors were nearby. Marcus turned to the group. "On my signal, we make a run for it. Don't stop until you're inside." They nodded in unison, each survivor preparing for the final dash. The tension was unbearable as they all crouched low, waiting for the right moment. And then, in the distance, the first undead shuffled into view, its eyes locked onto them. "Go!" Marcus shouted. The survivors ran, adrenaline fueling their every step, moving as fast as they could toward the gas station. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Not when the horde was closing in. The gas station was within sight now, and as they crossed the threshold, they slammed the door shut behind them. But they all knew, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The door slammed shut with a heavy thud, the echo reverberating through the gas station. For a moment, the group stood there, panting, their hearts racing from the adrenaline rush. The sound of the undead groaning and shuffling just outside the gas station's perimeter was a constant reminder that they had barely escaped death. Sarah leaned against the wall, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. Her legs trembled, the strain of their desperate sprint making her feel like she might collapse at any moment. But they were safe, for now. "Good work," Marcus said, his voice steady but edged with urgency. He was already moving, scanning the area, checking the windows, and ensuring the barricades were secure. His military training kicked in, and despite the chaos of the situation, his calm leadership was the one thing keeping the group grounded. Sarah watched him for a moment, impressed by his composure, before she turned to check on her family. Ben was sitting on the floor, his hands pressed to his face in an attempt to calm his nerves. Her father, too, was sitting down, though he had his eyes closed, trying to steady his breath. "Is everyone okay?" Sarah asked, approaching them both. Ben looked up at her, his eyes wide. I can't believe we made it out of there. I thought we were done for." "We were lucky," Sarah replied, her voice soft but filled with truth. "But we've made it this far, and that's what matters." She placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to reassure him, though she wasn't sure how much of that reassurance was for him and how much was for herself. Her father gave a faint nod, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We're all alive. That's the important thing. We need to keep moving." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. The safety they had found here was temporary at best. The gas station was just a brief respite, a fragile fortress in a world that no longer offered the comfort of safety. Zombies were relentless, and the noise from their brief encounter would undoubtedly draw more of them. They needed a long-term solution, and fast. Marcus had been listening to their conversation from across the room, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. He motioned for the group to gather. "Listen up," he said, his voice low and commanding. "We've got supplies, but not nearly enough to last long. We're not safe here. Not really. We need to find a more secure location, something with better defenses." "I agree," Sarah said, standing up. "We can't stay here long. We're exposed." Marcus looked around, taking in the gas station's defenses. "We'll need to move soon, but before we do, we have a decision to make. Do we keep pushing forward and risk running into more zombies? Or do we fortify this place and hold our ground for a bit longer?" Ellie, the young woman who had warned Sarah earlier, stepped forward. "We need to make a decision soon. The longer we wait, the more likely the horde will find us." Sarah felt a wave of frustration bubble up. They had been forced to make decisions on the fly since the outbreak, but the gravity of their choices now seemed heavier than ever. Every move could mean life or death. "What about the truck?" Leah, the other survivor, asked, her voice filled with determination. "We can load up the supplies and make a run for it. If we hit the road, we might find a safer spot." "We can't just drive off without a plan," Marcus countered. "We need to be smarter about this. The truck could attract zombies, and it's not exactly stealthy." There was a long pause as the group considered the options. Each choice felt like a gamble. No matter which path they took, they were at the mercy of the undead, and the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders. She glanced at Ben and her father, and then back at Marcus. She had to speak up, had to say what was on her mind. "We need to get to the old school," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "It's a larger building, and it's got better barricades than here. It might not be perfect, but it's better than staying in a gas station that's already compromised." Marcus considered her suggestion for a moment before nodding. "You're right. It's our best shot." Ellie frowned. "The school is a few miles away. We'd be exposed the whole way." "We can make it," Sarah said, her confidence growing. "If we leave now and keep to the back roads, we can avoid the main roads where the zombies are most concentrated." "I'll take point," Marcus said, already moving to gather his things. "Everyone else needs to stay low and stay together. We'll move quickly but cautiously. If we get split up, we're done for." The group started preparing to leave, gathering their supplies and weapons. The air inside the gas station felt heavy with the knowledge that they were about to step back into danger. The sense of urgency was suffocating, there was no time to waste. Sarah took one last look at the gas station. It had been a safe haven, a place to catch their breath, but it was a false sense of security. They had to keep moving forward, or risk being trapped in a world that was slowly but surely eating them alive. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his voice snapping her out of her thoughts. "As ready as we'll ever be," Sarah replied. With one final check of their gear, they opened the door to the outside world once more. The town of Crestwood was eerily silent, the faint sound of distant groans carried by the wind. The zombies were out there, lurking, waiting, searching for their next meal. But Sarah refused to let fear paralyze her. She had a family to protect, and a group to lead. She was going to survive this. They all were. As they moved into the streets, the silence weighed heavily on them. Every step was measured, every shadow a potential threat. The road ahead would be hard, but there was no turning back now. The school was their only hope. And as they made their way through the deserted town, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope deep within her, a glimmer that they might just make it out alive. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the deserted town. The air felt thick with tension, as though the world was holding its breath. The survivors moved in a tight formation, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an unsettling silence. The distant groans of zombies could be heard, but they were far enough away that they remained unseen for now. Sarah walked beside Marcus, her thoughts a swirl of confusion, fear, and determination. She had never imagined that she would be in a situation like this, fighting to survive in a world that no longer made sense. And yet, here she was, leading a group of strangers through a landscape that had once been familiar, but now felt like a foreign wasteland. Her father walked behind her, his eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. Ben stayed close to her side, still trembling from their earlier encounter at the gas station. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, but she also saw a glimmer of something else, something that had been absent when they first met: resolve. Ben was learning to survive. "Stay sharp," Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're getting closer to the school. But the closer we get, the more dangerous it will be. Keep your heads down, and don't make any unnecessary noise." Sarah nodded, her heart racing. She knew the risks. The school might be their best chance at survival, but it was also likely to be overrun with zombies. They had to be careful, every step of the way. They reached a fork in the road, where the path split between the main road and a narrow, overgrown alley that led toward the school. Marcus paused, studying both routes with a discerning eye. "We take the alley," he decided, his voice firm. "It's quieter, and it will keep us out of sight from the main roads. If we stick to the shadows, we can move faster." The group nodded in agreement, and they veered off the main road, moving down the narrow alley. The path was littered with debris, remnants of the world that had once been. Abandoned cars, overturned garbage bins, and broken windows lined the sides of the alley, giving them little cover as they moved. The sound of shuffling feet and low groans echoed from nearby, but there was no sign of the undead yet. It felt like they were moving through a ghost town, empty, abandoned, and haunting. As they moved deeper into the alley, Sarah could feel her nerves starting to fray. The longer they went without encountering any zombies, the more she feared they would run into a horde when they least expected it. She glanced over at Marcus, his face set in concentration as he led the group. "Do you think we'll make it?" Sarah asked quietly, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't look at her immediately, his focus on the path ahead. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "We'll make it as long as we stick together. We've already survived worse. This isn't the time to lose hope." His words were comforting, but Sarah couldn't shake the sense of unease that gnawed at her. Every step they took brought them closer to the school, but every step also brought them closer to danger. The alley grew darker as they moved further into it, the setting sun casting long shadows over the path. The air felt colder now, and Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself, wishing she could shake the chill from her bones. Suddenly, Marcus held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the area ahead. Sarah followed his gaze, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Ahead of them, two zombies shuffled slowly down the alley. Their eyes were glazed over, their bodies twisted and decomposing. The sound of their dragging feet was muffled by the silence of the alley. They didn't appear to notice the survivors, but that could change at any moment. "Stay still," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "They haven't spotted us yet, but we can't take any chances." The group froze, holding their breath. Sarah's pulse raced as she crouched low to the ground, her eyes locked on the zombies. Every instinct in her screamed at her to move, to run, but Marcus's command was clear: no movement. No noise. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as the zombies shuffled past them. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, and she could feel the weight of her own breath as she tried to keep her movements as quiet as possible. It was a nerve-wracking game of patience, waiting for the creatures to pass without giving away their position. Finally, the zombies passed by without noticing them. Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her, but Marcus was already on the move again. "Move," he ordered, his voice steady. "We keep going." The group continued down the alley, each of them more on edge than ever. The near encounter with the zombies had put them all on high alert. It was clear now that the world they once knew was gone, and survival was a matter of staying one step ahead of the undead. They reached the end of the alley, and before them stood the school, a looming, dark silhouette against the fading light. It was still standing, though it looked abandoned and overgrown. The gates were rusted, the windows shattered, and the once pristine walls now weathered by time and neglect. But it was shelter, and at this point, that was all that mattered. Marcus stepped forward, his eyes scanning the school's exterior. "This is it," he said. "We'll breach the gates, but we need to be careful. This place could be crawling with zombies." The survivors gathered around, taking a moment to catch their breath before making their move. Sarah felt the weight of their journey settling on her shoulders, but she also felt a surge of determination. They had made it this far, she wasn't going to let anything stop them now. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady. With that, the group advanced toward the gates, ready for whatever awaited them on the other side. The gates creaked and groaned as Marcus pushed against them, the rusted metal protesting every inch of movement. The sound was deafening, but they had no choice but to proceed, there was no turning back now. The group moved in silence, their footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air as they crossed the threshold into the school grounds. Sarah's eyes scanned the area. The school was eerily quiet, with nothing but the distant moans of zombies in the background. It was as though the undead had forgotten about this place, or worse, were waiting for them to let their guard down. The school had once been a place of laughter and learning, but now, it was a hollow shell of its former self, filled with the memories of children's voices and the promise of a future that would never come. "Stay alert," Marcus ordered, his voice firm and low. "We don't know what's waiting inside." Sarah nodded, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her knife. The air felt thick, heavy with the tension of what lay ahead. Every corner they turned was an opportunity for the undead to strike, and every dark hallway was a potential death trap. But they had no other choice. They needed shelter. They needed a place to regroup, to plan their next move. And the school was their best option. The group cautiously made their way through the courtyard, moving as quietly as possible. The tall, overgrown grass rustled underfoot, and the smell of decay hung in the air. The windows of the school were shattered, the frames twisted and bent by time and the ravages of the apocalypse. The once vibrant playground was now a forgotten relic, a playground for death. "There," Marcus said, pointing to a door on the side of the school. "That's our entry point. Keep your distance from the windows." The group moved toward the door, keeping their movements controlled and measured. Marcus approached the door first, gently testing the handle. It was locked. He pulled out a crowbar from his pack and wedged it into the crack, prying it open with a few swift movements. The door swung inward with a loud thud, and Marcus motioned for the others to follow. Inside, the school was just as abandoned as the outside. Broken desks were scattered across the hallway, papers and debris littered the floor. The walls were cracked and peeling, and the faint smell of mold and rot filled the air. It was clear that this place had been left to deteriorate for a long time. Yet, it offered the promise of safety, at least for the time being. The group stepped into the hallway, the dim light from the broken windows casting long shadows across the walls. Marcus signaled for them to stay close, and they began to move cautiously down the hall. They passed classrooms, their doors ajar, revealing nothing but empty desks and chairs. The silence in the school was almost deafening, the absence of human life creating a strange, unsettling atmosphere. "Anything?" Sarah whispered to Marcus, her voice barely audible. "Nothing yet," he replied, his eyes scanning every corner. "But that doesn't mean we're alone." As they moved deeper into the school, Sarah's anxiety began to rise. The further they went, the more isolated they felt. It was as if the world had stopped here, time had frozen in this hollow place. The air grew colder, and the silence became more suffocating with every step. Suddenly, there was a faint sound, a low groan, followed by a shuffle. It came from around the corner ahead. The group froze, their breaths held in the stillness of the moment. Sarah's heart raced as she strained to listen, her pulse pounding in her ears. Another groan. Closer this time. Marcus signaled for everyone to stop. "Stay still," he whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Wait for it to pass." The group held their breath, crouching low as the shuffling noise grew louder. The unmistakable sound of dragging feet echoed down the hall. Sarah's grip tightened on her knife as she prepared for whatever was coming. Her mind raced, was it a single zombie? Or a horde? The noise stopped just around the corner, and for a long, agonizing moment, they waited in complete silence. Sarah's pulse quickened, and her eyes never left the corner, waiting for the first sign of movement. And then it came. A single zombie, its ragged body stumbling into view. It dragged its feet slowly, its decayed face a grotesque mask of death. It was alone, but Sarah knew better than to assume it was the only one. Zombies traveled in groups, never alone for long. Marcus motioned for the group to follow him, and they moved silently, staying as close to the walls as possible. The zombie didn't notice them. It shuffled forward, unaware of the survivors just steps away. As it passed, Marcus made his move. With one swift motion, he grabbed the zombie's head and twisted it with a loud snap. The body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The group let out a collective breath, but Marcus's face remained stoic. "That's one down. Let's keep moving." They continued down the hall, moving more quickly now that they knew there were zombies nearby. The school seemed to be a maze of classrooms and hallways, each corner offering new dangers and new threats. But there was no turning back. The school was their best chance at survival, and they had to secure it. They reached the main entrance to the gymnasium, and Marcus signaled for them to stop. He peered through the cracked glass of the door, his eyes scanning the inside. "It's clear for now," he said. "Let's move in." The group entered the gym, finding it surprisingly intact. The bleachers were still in place, and the basketball court was mostly untouched. It was dark inside, the only light coming from the broken windows above. But it was spacious, and most importantly, it was defensible. If they could secure the doors and windows, they could hold up here for a while. Sarah's heart calmed slightly as she surveyed the gymnasium. They were safe, for now. But she knew that nothing in this world could be counted on as permanent. The undead would find them eventually, and when they did, the real fight would begin. As the group spread out to secure the area, Sarah allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had made it this far. But the war for survival was far from. The gymnasium doors creaked as they were bolted shut, and the survivors quickly spread out to fortify their defenses. The broken windows were covered with whatever materials they could find, desks, old gym mats, pieces of wood. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. The group had finally found a temporary haven in the heart of the school. But Sarah knew better than to think they were truly safe. The walls of the gym were thin, and the doors were far from indestructible. She felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her, but she refused to give in to the despair that had so often threatened to overtake her. "We need to be ready," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying the exhaustion they all felt. "We don't know how long we can hold this place, but we can't let our guard down." The survivors nodded, their faces drawn with fatigue but still filled with determination. They had been through hell together, and each of them had changed, become more than just individuals. They were a unit now, bound by the unbreakable threads of survival. Sarah's father, who had been quieter than usual, moved to the corner of the gym, his eyes unfocused. His hand was still shaking from the last battle. Sarah watched him for a moment before going to sit beside him. "We'll make it," she said softly, her voice carrying more hope than she felt. "We've come this far." He looked at her, his face worn with the scars of the journey. "I don't know how much more I can take, Sarah. I'm scared. Every time we think we're safe, they find us." Sarah took his hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "I know. But we can't stop now. We're stronger than we were when we started. And we've got each other." Her father's eyes softened, and for a moment, Sarah could see the man he once was. The man who had always been her rock. The world had taken so much from them already, but it hadn't taken their family, not yet. Ben, still haunted by his earlier moments of fear, approached them hesitantly. His hands were trembling, but his face showed something new, resolve. He had come a long way from the scared kid who had been thrust into this nightmarish world. "We should come up with a plan," Ben said, his voice steady, though still tinged with uncertainty. "If we're going to survive here, we need to be proactive. We can't just sit and wait." Marcus overheard and walked over, his expression serious. "Ben's right. We need to know what we're up against. We don't know how many zombies are out there or if they've gathered in larger numbers. We need to scout the area, plan our next move." Sarah's heart sank. She didn't want to leave the safety of the gym, but she knew Marcus was right. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that they would be discovered. They couldn't afford to be complacent, not now. "We'll go in pairs," Marcus continued. "Ben, you're with me. Sarah, you and your father check the back exit and the surrounding area. We need to know if anyone else is out there, alive or undead." Everyone nodded, and for a moment, it felt like they were preparing for battle. The world outside the school was as deadly as it had ever been, and no one could predict what horrors waited just beyond their door. As they prepared to leave the gym, Sarah took a deep breath. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Be careful," he whispered, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and pride. "You're stronger than you know." "I'll be fine, Dad," she replied softly. "We'll all be fine." With that, the survivors gathered their weapons and moved out. The gymnasium doors opened once more, but this time, the world beyond them felt more dangerous than ever. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the distant groans of the undead were louder than before. As Sarah and her father moved toward the back exit, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced over her shoulder, her instincts screaming that danger was closer than they realized. The world had become unpredictable, full of traps and enemies they couldn't see until it was too late. The back exit was as quiet as the rest of the school, but that didn't mean it was safe. Sarah carefully peered around the corner, her heart pounding in her chest as she scanned the area. There was no sign of the undead, but Sarah knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. "This way," she said, motioning for her father to follow. They moved along the side of the building, their footsteps muffled by the tall grass. The sun had long since set, and darkness had swallowed the land. The world felt even more oppressive in the dark, as though the shadows were hiding monsters waiting to pounce. Then, Sarah saw it. A shadow moving across the far side of the school. She froze, her heart racing. "Dad," she whispered urgently. "There's something out there." Her father strained his eyes in the dark, but he saw nothing. "Stay low," he muttered, as he crouched down beside her. They waited, watching the shadow move closer. The faint sound of dragging feet grew louder, and Sarah's pulse quickened. Zombies were nearby, and if they didn't move quickly, they'd be cornered. "Back to the gym," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. They began to move, But just as they reached the corner, a low growl echoed from behind them. Sarah spun around, her heart sinking as she saw the first of many zombies stumbling toward them from the other side of the building. "Run," her father shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the gym. They sprinted as fast as they could, but the zombies were gaining ground. The undead were everywhere now, emerging from the shadows like an unstoppable wave. Just as they reached the gym doors, a roar filled the air. A massive horde was on their tail, and the gym door slammed shut just in time. Sarah and her father collapsed against it, their hearts pounding in their chests. But as they caught their breath, Marcus and the others returned. They'd made their way through the school, but the world outside had changed. The undead had found them. And now, the final battle for survival was about to begin. There was no more running. It was time to fight back. End of Part 8, the end.